Okay, we are in political parties, lecture number 2. Following up, we finished off talking about the political parties, a little historical background. We're going to finish that up here, and I'm going to jump back to some slides that we showed at the end of that one, but we got a little rushed. So anyway, in the era of the two major parties, Democrats and Republicans, of course there are many others, and we'll talk about those later. We are going through the civil rights era, so you'll have seen these, okay, and I emphasized one word here. Democrats considered civil rights planks at the time, okay, so they were moving in that direction, as were, a lot of people at that time, and you can see there we had the Dixiecrats and the Democrats, okay, but as that was being adopted, that was causing the split, kind of a rift in the Democratic Party and the formation of the Dixiecrats. So we touched on that one, and continuing with civil rights. In 64, one of the things I wanted to touch on was the 64 presidential election. At the time, a lot of people don't know that. Your book doesn't cover it, so this is just more of that in-depth the detail. The 64 election, okay, with Lyndon Johnson and Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater being the Republican candidate. You remember we talked in civil rights back in the Civil Rights Act of 57, then 60, both under Eisenhower, both of which Barry Goldwater supported. Now in 64, we came to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which is considered, just the big milestone, covered so many things. There were a couple of points in that Barry Goldwater, as a Republican, actually more of a libertarian, opposed to, was that the federal government was getting too involved. So he wasn't opposed to civil rights, but he opposed the federal government getting involved. And so he opposed a couple of parts of the 64 Civil Rights Act and was then labeled, actually, anti-civil rights and kind of a segregationist. And so that kind of helped steamroll a lot of the Democrats. However, at the time, even in that period, we have to remember, too, Northern Democrats, as we covered a little bit before, and Republicans were the ones that crafted major civil rights legislation, including the Civil Rights Act of 64. The Democrats were split. Southern Democrats were not in favor of that. In fact, there was one of the longest filibuster in history came during that time against civil rights legislation. But it was also, at this time, one of the things I wanted to cover, because, as we mentioned, the purpose of political parties is to get voters, and they're competing for voters constantly. So we have the split in the Democrats. Even though the Republicans were cooperating with the Northern Democrats on legislation, civil rights legislation, they were also courting Southern states, okay, trying to move them from Democrat to Republican by using what was called the Southern Strategy and what began as promotion of states' rights and saying, look, we may be opposed to you, but we don't mind if you make the choice. So there was an interesting dichotomy, but that's what was going on at the time. So, and again, the Republicans were starting to court these and say, look, we just need to get them out of the Democrat camp. And if not in ours, keep them in their own. But they were competing. And we can't forget that even with as much cooperation as there was, they're constantly competing for votes in states. So, rolling realignment. We left off at this. Rolling realignment. I don't believe your book actually uses this term. It's an interesting term. You don't see it that often. And realignment, of course, what is not alluding to, what it's talking about, is parties do this periodically. In fact, I'm going to jump ahead down to the bottom. Generational change. You see parties realigning and people realigning and states realigning, okay, periodically throughout history, back and forth, depending on the issues, depending on the economy, depending on what's going on in foreign affairs, depending on a lot of things. So parties are constantly changing, and people are constantly moving from party to party, too. Anyway, the Democrats, for a long time, were the majority party in Congress. But after this realignment, which began with the Southern Strategy, which we just mentioned, the two became more fairly evenly matched. So we had the Republicans dominating prior to the Great Depression and the New Deal, and then the Democrats dominating for a long time. And then we see the realignment again, so they become fairly evenly matched. And you're going to see this shift back and forth in history, and we tend to see that, as we've talked about in class, how we've mentioned that the American people do like balance anyway. And so you see this shifting back and forth. Anyway, with this rolling realignment through the 70s and the 80s, Southern Democrats, as we mentioned, with the Southern strategy, sided with the Republicans, and some of them even became Republican. And conservative Democrats definitely were leaning more towards a states' rights point of view, which they weren't going to get with the new Democratic Party. Anyway, that's happening, and we may be seeing that again today. We're looking at with the Democrats or Republicans have gone through that early 2000s with Speaker Ryan and those types of things, and those people. And the Democrats may be doing the same thing with the squad, with AOC and a lot of people, and the progressives, the rise of the progressives. So this happens, and it goes back and forth. It'll be interesting to see how far that goes. Now, moving on. Current status of political parties. This is kind of how we tend to look at it, or at least the parties look at it. They look at the map, and, it's kind of where are the voters, or what state is what state's Republican, what state is Democrat. You can see the blue states are the Democrat states, the red states are the Republican states, and then what's with the purple? Well, purple is the mix of blue and red. So that is, I don't know how accurate right now, but we see that, and it's updated all the time. But the parties use this when they're campaigning, especially every 4 years. So this is kind of how the country looks. And regardless of, people say, oh, this is dominant throughout the country, or this party is. It's quite a mix, and we are very, very diverse throughout this country when it comes to that. Now, but we do use geography. We tend to refer to states as red states and blue states. Now, this is interesting. It's something I noted, and it's used by the Democrats, the Texas Democratic Party, as one of their symbols. And you see the use of both colors, which Texas, of course, a red state for a long time. And tends to, Austin, the capital, a lot of places with the population exploding, are kind of leaning a little more Democrat. So you see them kind of moving towards blue. And in this, I don't think it's an accident that they're mixing both. And I think that in this, they're maybe even implying a move from red to blue. But at the very least, it's red, white, and blue, which are colors and can be considered very patriotic. Now, where are we then? With this, we have okay, sorry. A little bit of a break there, and I've lost my controls. Okay, we're continuing. Sorry about that. Brief pause. Looking for the controls here. Lost them on my screen. Anyway, we have... as you can see, again, keeping with the strategy of reinventing, and every time you see an election, get used to this. They're going to predict things, and this is going to happen, or this did happen, and you're going to see a lot of exaggeration from all parties, from anybody that wants you to hear their message. Right now, we've got the New Dems, and that's what I see we're going through right now with the progressives. This other one here, this was after the midterm elections, when there was supposed to be this big blue wave of, Democrats taking over the House and the Senate. Now, they did take over the House, did not take over the Senate. And there was a big deal made of that. But one of the things we would discuss in class that I want to point out now is that in the midterm elections, and a midterm election is the election, the 2-year election, between the presidential elections, so that midterm, that it is very normal. It's quite normal, in fact, kind of expected, that the House and the Senate will go in the direction of the party opposite of whoever the president is, whoever holds the presidency. So if you have a Republican in office in the midterms, they'll go Democrat. If there's a Democrat, they'll go Republican. And we've seen this. We saw that not just in the House with Trump, but we saw that back with Obama. We saw that with Bush. We saw that with Clinton. We saw that it happened with everybody. Reagan, you go back and you see that happen. So even though they're talking about the big blue wave and that's it, and this is all over for whoever, in this case, the Republicans, when it didn't happen, and two, even if it had, that's normal. That's just what happens in our politics. So, all right, moving on. We call that, and it's called shifting, major change in public opinion and ideology, or business as usual. It really is business as usual in the cases we just talked about. De-alignment, parties or people aligned with one party, they lose touch with that party. The party heads in a direction, loses touch with them. We become detached. We become disappointed in the people that are representing us. And American people, for the most part, don't have a problem sticking with their beliefs and looking at the parties, looking at the people, and looking at the issues. So one of the good things that I think, in my mind, is that we've had the growth of the independents, which we'll talk about in just a second. I think it's an excellent, one, wake-up call for both of our major parties, but two, it means that younger people are getting involved. And that's always good news, because the younger voters have long been ignored by the major parties simply because they don't vote. And if we can get more young people voting, that can only benefit our country. Okay, here we go too. We're talking about majority party. One of the reasons I have this slide up here, you can see party registration by nationwide share. Now, the two things to take away from this. One, as I just mentioned, you can see, if you look at this, you'll see over the 18 years there, and I think it's continuing, I think it's been for the last 20 years, the increase in the number of independent voters, people, I think, thinking for themselves, and that's very, very important. The other thing to take from this is you have to look here too, that even the party with the highest registration, the Democrats, even they don't even hit 50%. Even they don't hit 45%. As we talked about before in the last election, when we mentioned, okay, somebody won, Clinton won, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. Well, she had more than everybody else, but she didn't have 50%. So, as part of the argument, what does it take to win? Does it take a plurality? Which clearly that's happened, because we can have a plurality in the popular vote, as Bill Clinton had with 43%, and still win the election. So when we get to that discussion, again, getting back to that in review, we have to be very, very careful. No party owns even 50% of the registered vote. So very, very important that we take that into consideration too when we're looking at these. They may sound like they're representing everybody, but they're really not. Okay. Current status of American political parties, continuing. Some other terms: tipping, alteration of political landscape. Now, actually, I probably should have, I'm going to jump ahead to identity politics. I probably should have put this one here first. So we tend to, or the parties do, or whatever, we look at people and say, okay, who are you? What are you? And so based on that, how are you going to vote? Okay. And we do tend to label people like that and to pigeonhole them. And sometimes we even bully them into thinking a certain way. And saying, well, if you're this, you must vote that way. And if you're that, you must vote another. So you go to this here, this. And again, women not only as a broader category fall into such labeling, but even unmarried versus single versus young, those types of things. So I thought this was an interesting way to look at it. If we took unmarried women, if we had all women voting one way, then we'd have a different result in an election. And this is why, it's why, pollsters, why political consultants, why they do this. They're always trying to guess as to how people are going to vote, and not only guess at that, but try to get you to vote a certain way. Okay, that's it for now. In the next edition of this, we'll start into functions of political parties. In the meantime, have a great day and a great weekend.